Hi, my name is Joanna Dobkowska-Kubacka. This presentation is based on my ongoing PhD research, which concerns the campaign for women's right to professional work in the 19th century Kingdom of Poland. I narrowed my research down to women from the Polish nobility and intelligentsia, and I put particular emphasis on women's aspirations to become professionals in the field of art. I assume most of my audience is not particularly familiar with the history of Poland. So I think it would be helpful to explain precisely what territory, region I am talking about. 19th century Kingdom of Poland does not closely coincide with the territory of the current Polish Republic, nor Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów, verbatim, the Republic of both nations, which is known as Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That state, you can see it now on the map, ceased to exist as a result of the partitions in the 18th century. Its territories had been divided between Russia, Austria, and Prussia. The final partition took place in 1795. At that point, the Polish state disappeared from the map for more than 100 years. Poles, however, continued to fight for its restoration. That is why they joined the Napoleon army, and as a kind of reward for their war effort, a Duchy of Warsaw was established. Duchy of Warsaw covered a part of Polish previous lands, not even half. After the defeat of Napoleon, and as a result of decisions taken at the Congress of Vienna, the territory of the Duchy of Warsaw became the basis for the establishment of the Kingdom of Poland, which in practice became a part of the Russian Empire and was subject to the Russian imperial policy. The capital city and the cultural center was Warsaw. Though my research focuses at the Kingdom of Poland, I had to take into account also the phenomena occurring in the Polish lands which remained outside Kingdom of Poland and belonged at the time to Austria and Prussia as their share of Polish partitions. They had to be taken into account because the leading classes of Polish society, which were at that time the nobility and the intelligentsia, consciously and with commitment, maintained a kind of Polish unity, regardless the borders, throughout the whole discussed period. It was achieved mainly through means of the Polish press and family and social contacts. Originally, as agreed at the Congress of Vienna, the Kingdom of Poland was to be united by a personal union with the Russian Empire, but to maintain its autonomy. In practice, it became a part of the Russian Empire. The reduction and later elimination of promised autonomy, accompanied by a policy of falsification repression, was the cause of the uprisings, which had a great influence on the fate of Polish society, especially women. The case of Polish female artists in the second half of the 19th century can be seen as an evidence supporting the thesis that so-called artist is a social role. It is the society that decides who is allowed to perform the role of an artist, in what circumstances and at what conditions. That is why it seemed important to me at the very beginning of this presentation to specify the place and time, since map. What happens in a certain place and time has a dominant influence on artistic production, that's obvious. In case of Polish 19th century female artists, the social, political, and economic circumstances determined not only the very right to do art, but also what women had been creating and how. It determined what genres they chose, or better said, what genres were available for them, what composition was the favorite one, etc. This very aspect I would like to develop in my presentation, but first I should acknowledge Linda Nochlin's famous essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?, as one of my inspirations to address these problematics. In her essay, Nochlin pointed out, from a historical perspective, that the artist profession was always associated with a specific class and gender affiliation, that the actor's practice always depends on the situation in which they grow up and on the patterns of behavior that accompany them from birth. Contrary to a popular opinion, artistic creation is not at all an autonomous process, but a social one, conditioned by specific social structures. Therefore, I believe that as such, it should not only be interpreted, but also evaluated. I based my research mainly on archival press publications because the campaign for women's right to educational and professional work was conducted predominantly in the press. In the Kingdom of Poland, the Polish press played a special role, replacing many public institutions. As a result of the Russification policy of the Tsarist government, Poles were gradually eliminated from public education, administration, and the judiciary institutions, generally from public services. But the press, although strictly censored, could still be published in Polish. In this situation, it became a bastion of national identity and reflected the life of a society that was not represented in official state institutions. Contemporaries noticed this phenomenon, for example, Eliza Rzeszkowa, a writer who enjoyed a significant respect in Polish society, noted in 1885 that the press was the only medium for public opinion to express itself on most of the social issues and the main instrument for promoting views. The Polish press, therefore, had a major impact on the spread of ideas, the formation of new attitudes, and the evolution of people's mindset. One of the so-called hottest topics were the controversies concerning the position and role of women in society, among it, female sex predisposition to execute art. This problematics was also referred to as the women question, and was very often discussed in articles, references, polemics, letters from readers, etc., especially in the press with a female audience. In many journals, publications about the women question created a separate section listed in the annual table of contents. Of course, the influence of the press was limited to certain social classes, mainly the nobility and intelligentsia, but as I mentioned before, I limited my research to these classes as well. The press center of the Kingdom of Poland was Warsaw during the discussed period. About 95% of all Polish periodicals published in the Russian partition were published in Warsaw. Here you can see the titles and years of edition of Kingdoms of Poland's Polish magazines, which most often commented on the professional, including artistic, activity of women. Some of these magazines were also published after the First World War, but I conducted my research in the annuals only until 1914. Many of listed magazines are available in digital form at the web address given at the bottom of this slide. Most statesmen in 19th century Polish press, especially in the first half of this century, claimed that not only the role of women's society as wives and mothers, but above all, women's nature, in the biological and psychological sense, excluded professional artistic activity. It was to be God's plan that humans should live in a dichotomous order. This order was manifested in gender division and gender-specific fundamental features. According to this essentialist approach, the male sphere was reason, while the female one was heart. Men were granted rationality and intellect in a broad sense, even intellectual exclusivity, and the ability to create abstract concepts. Women were denied intellectual predispositions. Their speciality was feeling. Generally, men think, women feel. The majority of Polish society share this view, including many women. Within the framework of the traditional world order, based on the gender dichotomy, women and men were given separate characteristics. Different tasks resulted from these characteristics. According to this worldview, the traditional role of women was justified precisely in her own nature. Any changes, therefore, as conservative argued, would harm both society and women concerned. This worldview was dominant in the 19th century Polish society, and not only among the upper classes. It was also propagated, notably it is still being propagated, by the Catholic Church. The fundamental, supposedly divinely sanctioned polarity served as a strong argument for the proponents of preserving the traditional gender status. They emphasized the threat which professional life posed to the spouse and material duties. They stressed that a woman's professional work was against nature and accused women who aspired to prestigious intellectual professions of an inappropriate ambition and immorality. Conservatives opposing female employment had in mind most of all intellectual employment. With manual occupations, the resistance to women's professional work was much weaker, or it even didn't exist at all, especially with working women from lower classes. Regarding this phenomenon, Maria Junicka, the editor of the women's magazine Łódź, pointed out their hypocrisy. She asked the opponents of women's intellectual work, who had argued that it takes a woman away from her family and her children, what was then happening to the children of the seamstresses, who spent their whole day in a factory? The work of a seamstress, standing low on the ladder of social prestige, poorly paid, and on the verge of starvation, as Junicka rightly noticed, was not controversial at all, and was even considered appropriate for a woman. So, while more or less keeping appearances and referring to the well-being of the family, for which a woman's professional work would create undesirable competition, the fight in the press was aimed at keeping a dichotomous world order. Referring to God and nature, conservatives tried hard to preserve male exclusivity in all areas of intellectual activity, and this included so-called real art, understood at that time as an intellectual field. Apart from the sphere of the intellect, however, there was another indispensable component of artistic activity, namely creativity. Women were also to be deprived of this in the conservative criticism of the time. For example, in 1874, Heinrich Struve announced in the magazine Quasi that women's nature was inherently more passive than creative. Women, therefore, are incapable to invent anything. They can only copy the manifestations of male genius. Regarding the so-called true art, woman was to remain a muse, inspiring artists with her beauty and charm. She also should be constantly the part of the admiring audience. She was irreplaceable as audience against because of her nature. The woman's innate feature was supposed to be sensitivity to beauty. The so-called true woman was predisposed to admire beauty in art, in landscape, in flowers, etc. She was meant to be sensitive, but not creative. Also, delicacy was attributed as an innate feature to women and consequently to all their work. In the case of the evaluation of female art, however, delicacy became the opposite of the power. The deficit of power was logically associated with weakness and was supposedly accompanied by shyness. In the context of art, shyness was not understood as a charming personal modesty, but as a lack of courage. According to the critics, lack of courage resulted in women's tendency to imitate male artists. Consequently, women were perceived as creatively dependent and unable to innovate. Maria Dolembianka, a painter and a social activist, discussed the alleged creative dependence of the female artist without denying the legitimacy of this accusation. But she explained the situation not by the women's nature, but by their living circumstances. She wrote in 1903, I quote, "The conditions in which a woman lives make her being as little independent as possible and thus as little creative as possible." End quote. According to critics, the women artists try to make up for this lack of creativity and the lack of impetus by painting with meticulousness and excessive focus on details. Here again, without denying the legitimacy of the accusation, the line of defense of female art ran in two directions. On the one hand, the passion for details could be given a positive spin, because details are also worth on an artist's attention and appreciation. On the other hand, focus on the minuscule was seen as another effect of upbringing and living conditions. Maria Dolembianka didn't question the women's tendency to concentrate on details. She believed, however, that the traditional role of women developed a specific way of looking at the world. Women were accustomed to noticing and remembering numerous details, but they could not cope with constructing a vision of the whole. According to Dolembianka, when living and educational conditions change, This so eagerly criticized feature of female creativity will disappear just like women's artistic dependence. Within the framework of the traditionally understood world order, women did, however, have an opportunity to engage in some artistic professions, such as being an actress, singer, pianist, dancer. 19th century public opinion considered the stage to be a suitable place for women, but only for women of a certain type. In their case, the problem of a professional career didn't arouse pro-family emotions, because actresses, dancers, etc. were morally suspicious by definition and were not understood to be fit wives and mothers. The conflict between the calling to raise the family and practice a profession didn't concern them. Above all, however, the acceptance of the aforementioned artistic activities as possible for women was based on their reconstructive, not creative character. Singers, pianists, actresses performed the work of male composers and playwrights. Their art was based on the best possible rendering of the author's idea or possibly interpretation, and it was not an attack on the position of a man as a creator. Despite the columnists who attributed to women a lack of intellectual and creative predisposition, the dynamic growth of Polish women's artistic aspirations could be observed in the Kingdom of Poland since the 1840s. Initially, this growth was mainly in the field of literature. This phenomenon gained some social support due to the specific combination of political and cultural factors. The defeat of November uprising in 1832 was followed by so-called the Great Immigration of Polish intellectuals and writers, mostly to Germany and France. This, in turn, had caused soon a demand for artists on the spot, in the Kingdom of Poland. At the beginning of the 1840s, attempts to revive Polish culture and break it out of the stagnation in which it fell because of the Lost Uprising and the post-revolt Russian government repressions became intensified. The circles involved in the awakening of Polish artistic life treated almost every creative activity, especially in the field of literature, as a contribution to the development of the national culture. Even in the case of works far from outstanding, critics believed that it was their patriotic duty to motivate authors to continue their efforts, and not to discourage them if such an effect were to experience severe evaluation. They therefore supported good intentions and mobilized debutants, men and women, because women also wanted to fill this gap in artistic activity, to continue their work, and to improve it. With that support, however, also went attempts to limit women's creativity to defined areas corresponding to so-called female nature. Thus, women were granted the right to try their hand at poetry, as well as to create didactic novels containing a moral message for readers, especially young female audience. However, Polish society of that time had a more favorable opinion of the female authors who combined literature ambitions with their so-called natural women's educational vocation. Society perceived literature for children and young people not so much as a creative, but rather as an educational activity, for which a woman, as a mother, real or potential, was to be appointed by nature. According to contemporary critics, children's literature was the greatest field in which a woman who wanted to write books could excel. Such literature was to have not only a pedagogical character, but also to be characterized by strong sentiment and a certain infantilism with which to better influence young readers. Sentimentality and infantilism fit in well with women's nature as traditionally understood. Women were supposed to get these features from God to facilitate contact with children. Thus, two interconnected activities, pedagogical literature and teaching, became the professional specialization of Polish women from the gentry intelligentsia at that time. Polish women writing educational books for children and teenagers in 1840s could also refer to Klementyna Tańska-Hoffmanowa, a person highly respected in Polish society. Hoffmanowa was the first Polish woman to make a living from writing. She made her debut in 1819. She wrote educational textbooks and novels for girls. She was also associated with schools for girls. The model of female education proposed by Hofmanova, according to her, girls should be very well prepared for the role of mother, wife, housekeeper, and should be also patriotic and religious. So this model, called canon, was very popular in the Polish society throughout the 19th century. Hofmanova set an example for 19th century Polish women wishing to combine pedagogical activity with literature. For example, Paulina Krakowowa, who debuted in 1840s, wanted to imitate her. She was both a writer and a teacher, as many others. Speaking about the poetry, the most popular Polish female poet from the first half of 19th century was Narcyza Żmichowska. She was from the impoverished noble family and worked as a governess. She took the pseudonym Gabriela and debuted in 1841. Contemporary critics appreciated her talent very much. According to one of them, Wacław Szymanowski, Żmichowska was supposed to be much better than any other female poet. She was successful also as a novelist. Another popular poet at that time was Jadwiga Łuszczewska, pseudonym Deotyma, who became famous for her talent for poetic improvisation. She didn't have to work professionally, as she came from a sufficiently affluent family. Already in her early youth, she became a star of the literature salon run by her mother, Magdalena Łuszczewska. After mother's death, Deotyma herself ran a literature salon. According to the critic, Wacław Szymanowski, she wrote long historical poems that were both boring and lengthy. In the second half of the 19th century, the literary profession was already a recognized profession for women and didn't cause much controversy. Most female writers still wrote the so-called literary literature for children, but some of them already dared to write real novels for adults. The work of Eliza Orzeszkowa, a representative of positivism, enjoyed great recognition. Orzeszkowa's novel entered the canon of Polish reading, as did the poetry of Maria Konopnicka. At the turn of the century, another outstanding figures of Polish literature debuted: Gabriela Zapolska, the novelist and playwright, and Zofia Naukowska, the novelist. The next historical milestone that had a great impact on the Polish women's professional artistic activity was the January uprising. Its defeat in 1864 led to the bankruptcy of many Polish landowners. It was mostly the result of Russian repressions. The punishment for participation in the uprising was often exile to Siberia and confiscation of property. But the economic conditions also changed due to the peasants' enfranchisement, which the Tsarist government carried out in the Kingdom of Poland at this time, wanted to undermine the position of Polish landowners, so they could not count on a free labor force anymore. So many of the landowners introduced savings. No more they could support the large number of poor relatives, who usually were old maids and widows living in their estates. Also, many landowners sold what was left to be sold and migrated to cities. All these changes meant that many gentlewomen had to face the necessity of earning their living. Many upper-class women started to desperately seek paid jobs. The colonists noticed that ladies looking for a job were in extremely difficult position. They were not qualified for any work except maybe that of governess. But in the second half of the 19th century, supply in the teaching profession quickly exceeded demand. Literature didn't provide enough income to live on. The narrow range of activities suitable for and accessible to ladies became a huge problem. It was necessary to find another income opportunities. Professionally practiced art appeared to be one of those opportunities. As in the case of literature, here also columnists tried to find a compromise between women's aspirations and conservative views on female nature by repeating this specialization moment. 19th century experts on female nature ascribed to women innate manual skills, which were given by God to enable good housekeeping. Women were supposed to have as well an aesthetic sense, which helped them to please men. This aesthetic sense was insufficient to create pure high art, which filters reality and distills it to the sphere of the humanities ideals. But it was just enough to make things prettier. Thus women had been granted, which is still the case today, the right to take care of their own beauty by fashion, cosmetics, and ambience, interior decoration, decoration of objects, etc. That is why the female specialization in the field of art was to become, and has become, applied art. Previously, however, in the early 1870s, craftsmanship was promoted as a suitable because manual occupation. Many schools and craft courses were established to solve the problem of paid work for ladies. Among the women from higher classes, there was even a fashion for learning a selected branch of craftsmanship. However, it soon turned out that most of the nowe rzemieślniczki, new artisans as they were called, could not cope with the labor market. Their time-consuming and laborious products didn't withstand the competition with the products of the skilled craftsmen, who were much better trained than new artisans. They were also factory products, much cheaper than craftsmen's products available on the market. In this situation, the educational fashion has shifted to applied arts, and there has been another flood of schools and courses for women, this time in artistic area. These schools were often founded by women themselves, which was an additional option for them to earn money. On the slide, you can see portraits of several directors of female schools for applied arts in Warsaw in the second half of the 19th century. For Polish women in the 19th century, access to so-called pure art was much more difficult than to literature or applied arts. But there was also an attempt to find them a niche. First, female nature was supposed to be deeply religious. This view was shared by many men and women. One can refer here to the statements of writer and philosopher Eleonora Ziemiańska, editor and writer Maria Zielnicka, or Eliza Krasińska, aristocrat, wife of one of the Polish best-known poets, Zygmunt Krasiński. All of them were convinced that the characteristic feature of feminine nature were idealism and deep religiosity. Therefore, critics like Edward Naleś proposed for women with artistic aspirations religious painting. In the Kingdom of Poland, in the second half of the 19th century, Bronisława Wisiałowska and Maria Łubińska inter alia specialized in religious painting. Founded by the latter, Zakład Świętego Łukasza kind of factory employed only women and consisted of 4 departments. One of them was the Department of Religious Paintings for churches. Probably, women made many anonymous religious pictures in the second half of the 19th century, which are now scattered around various Polish churches. Polish women painters of the discussed period, however, mostly painted portraits. Anna Bilińska, who specialized in portraits, enjoyed a great recognition of her contemporaries. The most famous of her works, turning point in Bilińska's career, was the self-portrait, awarded a medal at the Salon in Paris in 1887. Afterwards, she enjoyed a successful international career, won many prizes, got many commissions, not only from Polish patrons. She was the one who truly could live from her artistic profession. Here on this slide you can see some of her paintings. In the history of art, however, Bilińska gave way to Olga Woznańska, who was recognized as one of the most outstanding Polish artists, regardless of gender. Here on this side you can see some of her paintings. Emilia Dukszyńska-Dukszta and Maria Nościc-Wasilkowska were not artists of the same class as Woznańska or Bilińska, but they enjoyed considerable recognition in Polish society too. They were popular as portrait specialists during the discussed period. At first, Emilia Dukszyńska-Dukszta specialized in pastel painting, then she mastered her skills in oil painting. She was considered a good, recommended, and trustworthy portraitress. Maria Nościc-Wasilkowska, who graduated from the Academy of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg, also became a portraitress. In St. Petersburg, she was awarded a silver medal, for which, according to a critic's report, she was competing against more than 100 male artists. She received many commissions from the Russian aristocracy. She made, for example, portraits of the family of the minister Vorontsov-Dashkov. The portrait specialization of women painters from the second half of the 19th century was seen by the contemporary columnists as another manifestation of women's nature. The female artist's assets were to be the ability to give the picture a cozy, warm atmosphere and to establish emotional contact with the portrayed person, which resulted in a better capture of the model's personality on canvas. The most important aspect of this specialization, however, seems to have been the financial factor. It was easier to obtain commissions for portraits than for any other genres. It was just easier for women to earn money in that way. And because of the lack in artistic education, it was easier for them to paint portraits when they pictured one or two persons. Quite often, female artists painted also so-called types, like Italian women, gypsy women, etc. Nearly all 19th century Polish female painters depicted one, very seldom more than two characters in a picture, both in the case of genre scenes and the religious work, not to mention portraits where it is obvious. In general, female artists also show their subject in a tight frame. Conservative critics, such as Heinrich Struve, perceived this choice as another manifestation of feminine nature, which was supposed to introduce intimacy, subtlety, focus on details, etc., and at the same time unable to gain the power and momentum typical for the male nature and male works. The fact that women didn't usually paint multi-figure historical compositions, typical for academicism and highly valued by critics at that time, was a common criticism leveled against female art. From that phenomena, it was concluded that there was no female predisposition in create real art in general. The Polish 19th century critics understood the painting as an artistic poem, which should contain a clear message and present a story. They evaluated painting on the basis of how well the painter fulfilled the task of rendering ideas on canvas. Illustrating the subject, idea, imagined scene, etc., was evidence of an artist's inventiveness. The same testimony was not provided by the practice of so-called imitative genres, for example, portrait, landscape, still life. The characteristic trait of academicism, the style dominating in the discussed period, was the thematic hierarchy. Critics, rewarding the narrative element in art, highly rated and considered as the most prestigious multi-figure historical compositions, which they called great topics and serious painting. Although the rest of the genres belonged to pure art, they had a bit of a mixture of applied art, as they played an utilitarian role, either decorative or commemorative. Without undertaking to paint historical compositions, the female painters condemned their work to being perceived by Polish critics as inferior. During the discussed period, supporters of women emancipation in the field of art constantly hoped that female artists would eventually take up historical compositions, because the choice of topics entails consequences for their professional position, and if it was appropriate, could remove the stigma of amateurism from female art. While amateurism, women's aspirations to become professionals in the field of art were in opposition to the then socially accepted amateur practice of art by the ladies. The framework of the traditional so-called salon education, which applied to almost all upper-class girls in Poland from the 18th to the end of the 19th century, despite attempts to reform education, consisted of learning foreign languages, music, drawing, and often watercolor painting. I discuss here only the position of Polish girls of the time, but a parallel phenomenon occurred in many other European countries distant from Poland, such as Spain. On the one hand, this kind of artistic touch was supposed to emphasize a maiden's sensibility and subtlety and ensure her social status and successful marriage. On the other hand, it contributed to treating women's creativity in general as amateurism and dilettantism, because it was as well known fact that ladies were killing time with more or less successful executed pictures, which were kindly admired in company, but were not taken seriously as art. These pejorative cliches had to be confronted by the professional pioneer women artists who usually had significant shortages in their professional preparation compared to male artists. Polish women artists didn't generally undertake to paint these multi-figure compositions, which at that time were so highly regarded by critics. First, that was because of the financial reasons mentioned above. The portraits were easier to sell than historic paintings, which execution requires more time and effort. But the specific of women's artistic themes in the second half of the 19th century were closely related not only to economic issues, but to the circumstances of education in general. Women usually didn't paint multi-figure compositions because they lacked preparation in this area. They painted what they had the opportunity to learn. In the case of visual arts, it was difficult to make up for the lack of formal education on one's own. In the case of literature, self-education was of much more help. This fact was noticed by economists supporting emancipation. For historical painting, an academic education was necessary. The great topics required solid professional preparation. Anatomy lessons, naked model studies, studies of the human body in motion. This was the most important element of the education program in fine arts academies. But in the discussed period, academies of fine arts were either closed to women in general, which was the Polish case, or open, for example, in Spain, under certain conditions, which meant that women could not attend the most advanced levels of art studies, the very classes of naked model study and of composition. Naturally, this fact had consequences not only for the topics undertaken by women, but also for the level of their professional skills. Polish private art schools for female students provided very limited training in comparison to the curriculum in academies. Graduates of these schools simply painted what and how they could. There was, however, for determined Polish women with artistic aspirations, an opportunity to study the naked model. They could go to France and enroll in so-called free academies. For example, Académie Julian, private school which admitted both men and women. But that solution was an expensive remedy. Besides, for many women artists, there was still moral barriers. The so-called decent female had a great problem with nudity, both someone else and her own. Women were brought up in such a way that nudity discouraged them. The artist had to break through this reluctance. Public fine academies eventually opened their doors to women at the beginning of the 20th century. The School of Fine Arts, which admitted men and women, was established in Warsaw in 1904. But then, historical painting was out of fashion. Consistently, the increasingly higher evaluation of women's painting is also connected with the fact that the canon of academic painting, the hierarchy of topics, clearly lost its force and then ceased to apply at all. The press, not only the Polish one, often published caricatures in which the joke was based on an exchange of male and female roles. These images used such well-known stereotypes as the image of an ugly, masculinized savant who smokes a cigar, for instance. Also, women artists, especially those who were outstanding, successful, and awarded medals, were perceived as unnatural creatures, neither male nor female. Since the nature attributed to a woman was to be reproductive, not creative, passive and not active, the woman who creates, and what's more, does it well, turns into a quasi-man. And so we come to the issue of masculinization, which, depending on the position, was a charge or ambition in the 19th century. According to conservative critics, female art, due to its feminine nature, will always bear the stigma of imitation and weakness. A work whose artistic value was highly rated, however, and which was difficult to depreciate despite its feminine authorship, must have had a masculine character, and its creator was attributed either the denial of her femininity or an inborn lack of femininity despite her sex, which placed her in the position of an involuntary and guilty freak of nature. The most famous and valued male women artist, so-called male women artist, of her time was Rosa Bonheur, a French painter and sculptor, known especially for her naturalistic paintings depicting animals. In 1865, she was the first woman in the history to be honored with the French Legion of Honor. Discussing her work, critics emphasize Rosa's male psyche and behavior, her quasi-male appearance, including her short hair, her fondness for men's clothing. She had official permission from the police to wear trousers, and so on. On Polish soil, an example of painting which came from the brush held by a woman, and to which a masculine character was constantly attributed, was the painting of Anna Bilińska. Since Bilińska won the silver medal at such a prestigious exhibition as the Paris Salon, the high value of her works remained undisputed for Polish critics. It was not appropriate to describe the works of the medalist as weak, imitating, without momentum, etc. But if they were very good, they had to be masculine. Critics' statements of Bilińska's work repeatedly used this term. Much was written about this artist's male courage and about the male power of her brush. The contemporary critic, Czesław Janowski, believed that, I quote, Bilińska's talent was primarily male. This masculine character of the outstanding feminine work manifested itself not only in the field of fine arts, but also in literature. When Wacław Szymanowski wrote about Narcyza Żmichowska in 1855, he highly valued her abilities. In his opinion, I quote, her talent was far superior to that of other women who tried their hand at poetry. Immediately after this word of recognition, an explanation follows, I quote, in this female body, the male soul was burning, end quote. According to Szymanowski, Żmichowska was an exception. In her case, the denial of herself, of her own nature, could be regarded as a heroism and a sacrifice made on the altar of talent. It was justified because Żmichowska's talent, by an odd coincidence, indeed was great. But according to Szymanowski, in other cases of female artistic aspiration, the result would be only freakish. When a woman, therefore, does not want to abandon her creative ambitions, she runs the risk of losing her feminine qualities. When she becomes an outstanding artist, she stops being a woman. For those who didn't feel ready for a similarly radical step, this so-called medium level remained, the class of artistic craftswomen. It was this level which many women artists of the second half of the 19th century were content with. This is how they were perceived by the contemporary art critics, even the favorable ones. And this is how, unfortunately, contemporary art history still sees them, although it more and more often vacuums individual characters from the dust of observation and analyzes the conditions in which they had to pave the artistic path. At the end of the 19th century, another trend of narration about women artists, challenging to the believers of the limited feminine nature, gained in importance and even began to dominate in the Polish press. This heroic ethos, or a heroic narrative, exposed hardships and struggles which at the early stages of their careers were experienced not only by brave female students, who were starving to death in the Arctic, breaking the stereotypes of female scientists, but also by the first professional female artists. All overcame adversity thanks to talent, willpower, determination, and faith in the improvement of humanity. Again, the case of Bilińska, a medal winner at the Paris Salon, was very meaningful here. She served as an example and also as an argument in discussions of what goals and professional success a woman could achieve, but also how much it cost her. in the prevailing social systems. The death of 36-year-old Glińska was then interpreted as a result of the financial difficulties with which she struggled and which put her health at risk. If Polish society had facilitated the work of talented person, no matter her sex, Glińska might not have become terminally ill, died prematurely, and she could have created many other outstanding works for the glory of Polish culture. This was the meaning of the text which the poet Maria Konopnicka, embittered by her own struggle for financial stability, wrote and published in magazine Cry. She bluntly accused an insensitive conservative society of this painter's premature death. Konopnicka wrote dramatically about how cold Glińska's workplace was because the painter had not had enough money for heating, how she had to save on food and very often was hungry, etc. The young painter, however, didn't give up, strove for success and managed to do so, and I quote, "She ran to the very top and she fell down there." Quoted. Also, the later husband of Glińska, Antoni Bogdanowicz, recalled the very difficult condition of Glińska's life when she was not famous yet. A painter and friend of Glińska, Józef Chełmoński, called her in 1893, I quote, "a true martyr and art priestess." I consider the year 1904 as a symbolic caesura in the women's artist situation in the Kingdom of Poland. It is the date of the establishment of the School of Fine Arts in Warsaw, where women and men were theoretically equally admissible. Thus, the beginning of the 20th century marks the end of the first pioneering stage of women's struggle for admission to the Parnassus. The generation with artistic ambitions that began its career in the Kingdom of Poland after 1904 acted under altogether different conditions, both institutional and mental, compared to women who tried to be professional artists in the 19th century. In summary, the 19th century struggle for the chance to practice art professionally was part of the pan-European battle for women's right to self-determination. Polish women from the higher social classes also joined this movement. This situation was significantly influenced not only by the emancipation progress observed abroad, but also, and more importantly, by the specific political and economic situation of the country, and by the attitude of Polish society towards women, a social cultural role assigned to them, especially in the aspects of duties, privileges, autonomy, and authority. Due to their gender, the first professional Polish women artists had to confront social expectations, including not only total opposition because they went beyond the traditional roles that included only three: wife, mother, housekeeper, but also the conditional consent, expressed in directives or demands, that is, what they should create and how. In particular, the earning aspect is an important determinant of women's work in this period, and it is worth emphasizing. The whole system of artistic education, with the extent it impaired women, and the institutional framework in which art functioned in the second half of the 19th century were also of great importance. The types and topics of women's work from the discussed period therefore strictly depended on economic conditions on the one hand and access to professional education on the other. Women painted what they had the opportunity to learn. Consequently, 19th century women painters avoided multi-figure compositions, which in the academic hierarchy were so-called crown of painting. The intimacy attributed to women's painting was in fact not connected with women's nature and an orientation toward intimacy, subtlety, etc. It was more the effect of such mundane reasons as financial background and gaps in education. But the choice of painting genres was also influenced by the pioneer's level of aspirations. Most Polish women artists from the 19th century were quite satisfied, proud, that overcoming many difficulties and thanks to many sacrifices, they gained at least professional level. All these interrelated factors, political, economic, and sociological, determined not only the character of creativity, but also the very phenomenon of women practicing art. I think, taking into consideration all discussed factors, institutional and social obstacles, difficulties in fulfilling the artistic potential, it is justified to look at the art of women in the discussed period, not so much in terms of the artistic value, but pioneering merit. They have built the tradition of Polish women's artistic activity. Such a tradition was more difficult to create in visual arts than in literature because of the education system. But it was only thanks to this artistic tradition that the appearance of outstanding Polish artists in the 20th century, such as Zofia Stryjeńska, Tamara Łępicka in the first half of the century, or Magdalena Abakanowicz in the second half, became possible. Thank you for your attention.